Okay, got it in one. Got it in one, everybody. Let's do a video. Yeah, I sat down for maybe 15 seconds before I put this build together, then just kind of put on the gear that made sense. Went with some kind of interesting options in the Book of the Dead Sacrifice as well as in the Paragon, and I like to introduce y'all to a Sever build that doesn't suck. It turns out that if you just like take away all the stuff that made Shadow build strong and completely replace them with generic damage multipliers that you don't need to ramp, Sever is a good build. Now, if you walked out of the patch notes for Season 5 PTR without any of the context of the new additions of Lochran's Amulet as well as the Helm of Lucian, and you did the math like I did for Sever builds, you might have walked away thinking that they were going to lose something like 60% of their total damage. And they absolutely did. The nerfs to the Blighted aspect, as well as just the general reliance of Sever on all of these like weird secondary systems for being able to ramp its damage, most notably Grasping Veins as well, were always something that held the build back. It desperately wanted to just be a Shadow version of Bone Spear, which is a high crit chance, high area of effect, straight line missile damage ability, but needed to ramp up Blighted stacks. It needed to wait on Grasping Veins with your Corpse Tendrils. It needed to do 100 instances of damage before it even gained access to its biggest damage multiplier in Blighted. And basically all of that got nerfed into the ground. And you might think, well then, hey, Mac, how'd you make it better? How'd you make it do anything? Again, with the addition of the unique generic items that are now in the game, they kind of took all of those pain points away. So let's go ahead and look at the build, the Book of the Dead, skill tree, everything. I assume the vast majority of this will change actually walking into Season 5, because there's no way that the majority of these items actually stay in the current power state that they are. But that just means that we're going to have a really good basis by which to then theory craft off of once we inevitably get those patch notes. Use the planner down below if you're somebody who wanted to look at kind of the fallout or the general feedback from the Season 5 PTR to get an idea of what this build looked like. And the one that just kind of cruised its way through that tier 100, no sweat. That was literally a one and done recording. I just went, hey, this build's actually doing pretty good. Let me get some footage. I think we'll be able to do a build guide after. I think I want to go ahead and just start off with the items because I think that will kind of paint the picture of how everything else makes sense. Most notably, we're completely building around Lochran's Talisman. Lochran's Talisman is just strictly better than Grasping Veins ever was, while making all of our damage consistent because it just applies a flat amount of additional critical strike chance, gives us attack speed, which is a huge overall multiplier of our damage here, gives us a ton of very generic additive crit damage, which oddly enough is kind of hard to stack on a build like this, since none of our Shadow Tempers actually really work for Sever, which is, I'll call it funny, but it's mostly just concerning. But then it adds on a huge multiplier for however much of our maximum essence we're able to maintain. And on the build right now with an essence potion, I have 279 essence, which actually goes up even further once I trigger Bone Storm. And again, we'll get to the Paragon board in a hot second. But that means that we're going to be sitting at 295 maximum essence without like perfect masterworks with no GAs on the gear really to speak of. And that's giving us a whopping 195% damage multiplier whenever we crit. Yeah, that's a lot. To feed into this same system, we're using the Crown of Lucian. Crown of Lucian says you cast 5 spells that cost essence, and you deal 125% additional damage. That's right, a 2.25 multi on this crown. The maximum resource on it naturally feeds into the Amulet of Lochran that we're using, so that's even more additional maximum essence for a larger multiplier. Gives you maximum life as a survivability stat, and ours is even a min roll on core skills. You can get even more additional ranks to the Sever skill itself, which will go significantly further to boost the damage than what you just saw. And to basically completely negate the addition of this helmet's additional resource cost, because once you're up to 5 stacks on this, your resource cost is actually increased by 50%, although it's additive resource cost, which is different than multiplicative reduction of resource cost. It's a little bit weird there. But Starless Skies famously reduces your resource cost by 50%. We have even more resource cost reduction on one of our other rings, and it adds on another 50% multiplier. Add on top of that, the stats on this are actually going to get revamped walking into Season 5, because if you notice, the critical strike damage on this ring is a whopping 20, and oddly enough, you get a lot more additive damage than even on a regular legendary piece of gear nowadays. So this ring is just going to become stronger walking into that season. Then for the rest of what we got to do, we basically just need to further empower these systems, make sure Sever is doing as much damage as possible, and then cap all of our resistances and armor. Oh, that's right, I forgot. I didn't cap my armor for that run. I didn't even come vaguely close to dying at any point, and I kind of just laughed at all of the attacks of the monsters, even when they weren't fully crowd controlled, which was like wildly surprising. I just forgot to swap over this ring to a skull, so I would be capped on this setup. I just forgot to do it, and it was perfectly fine. I don't know, man. Sever just got strong, I guess. For the armor, essence per second is the biggest stat here. Then we add on the armor, and the total armor to be able to reach cap. You can go with maximum life. You can go with intelligence. You'll notice that like my gems are kind of random too. I forgot to redo my gems, but I would have even more maximum life if I took out this topaz, which is definitely what I would end up doing. Heart and bones for the DR. For the gloves, Sever ranks, critical strike chance, and then attack speed. We went with more critical strike damage for the temper, and then crowd control duration. Because Sever is still a little bit of a ramping build, right? You need to get your ramp up on Lucian as well as Starless Skies. There's a little bit of ramp here, as well as being able to apply vulnerable with the skill itself after a certain number of casts. We do want crowd control duration just to hold everything closer together so that we're able to basically apply our damage as long as possible. The Great Feast is an aspect that you probably weren't expecting to see on this build here, but it's a 45% just generic multiplier, even if we don't have minions out, and it's actually increasing our essence loss rate by an additional 7 per second, and we're still able to fully maximize our essence uptime. We have 100% essence the entirety of the fight, even with all of the additional costs from Lucian, so that's actually fairly impressive for the output of this build, considering neither my armor nor my boots currently have a masterwork crit on essence per second, which is what you would want. For the pants, I'm actually going with a legacy version of Tybalt's Will because the roll on this is higher than what my current season 4 Tybalt's Will were, so that's like hilarious. But another 1.2 multi whenever we come out of Blood Mist. You could also go ahead and put like Metamorphosis down onto your boots to be able to trigger this more often. But the big thing here is that they are pants that only give damage reduction, but also give maximum resource, again, further feeding into the Lochran's Amulet. For the boots, the movement speed, essence per second, maximum life, or intelligence. Here, I would also want crowd control duration, but you can go with a lucky hit chance to be able to apply a hard CC. It's definitely not a bad idea. More movement speed. Then we're going with Cursed Aura. This will automatically apply our version of our curse to any monsters that we come into contact with the secondary benefit of also applying Iron Maiden. So you can actually completely take your curse off of your bar. I personally wouldn't do that because being able to curse a pack of monsters and then sever into them from afar is a huge overall efficiency gain. But what this does is allow you to have better uptime on damage against bosses that you generally want to stand next to and not have to worry about recursing targets while you're dishing out damage after they got pulled in by corpse tendrils. For the weapon, the funny part here is that like this weapon is trash. That's like quite honestly, no greater affixes on it, not maximum rolls across the board, but intelligence, maximum life, and then we would want crit damage here. We would want even more crit damage on the actual weapon temper, and then chance for Sever projectiles to hit twice. This is where we're putting Damned. Damned is just strictly better than Blighted now in every way, shape, and form if you're a darkness build. Damned says once you curse a target, you do 100% shadow damage against them. Blighted says that after you deal 80 instances of shadow damage to a target, gain 100% damage for 6 seconds. So Damned has 100% uptime, Blighted has like an 70 to 80% uptime, and that's why you're going to notice, real quick sneak peek here, we're not using the Blighted aspect. That's right. The historically strongest aspect in the game forever and the strongest aspect in the game for darkness builds is not going to be run on darkness builds anymore because you don't have 100% uptime on the Blighted bonus. So Great Feast, as long as you can manage the essence cost, is just strictly better. And Damned is strictly better on a two-hander, even if you would have 100% uptime because you can proactively curse targets as opposed to proactively deal damage 80 times. So that's just also a kind of funny thing to recognize here. On the ring, we're going with Sacrificial. On a darkness build, Sacrificial is going to be boosting your vulnerable damage multi, which I'm actually not currently using, and we'll talk about that in a hot second, your shadow damage multi, and your crit damage multi. It ends up being something like a 41 or 47% damage increase here. You can also use it to be able to crit cap in case your particular critical strike chance isn't at 100%. It has a lot of flexibility in what it can do. And it's also offering us another very interesting avenue to power from the Book of the Dead. And talking about that Book of the Dead, we're going with Reapers for shadow damage increase here. We're also going with Shadow Mage Sacrifice. The interesting part here is it's going to gain us 30% plus an additional 60 from Memento Mori. So that is a whopping additional 18. So it's 48% essence cost regeneration, which is going a long way to help maintain this permanent uptime on being able to spam on this setup until we get better stats in our gear. But it's also giving us that same amount of maximum essence. Again, maximum essence normally would not even compare to vulnerable, but since maximum essence works as a multiplier from Lochran's, it is While not strictly as strong as the vulnerable, the added benefit of the resource management is outperforming what that increase in damage would get us, because we wouldn't be at 100% uptime of being able to spam Sever. And obviously, lastly, we're just going to go ahead and sacrifice Iron Golems for the huge crit multi here. So now that we've explained the gear, I think the skill tree will make more sense in how we wanted to approach it. So no generator here, maxing out the normal things that you would, imperfectly balanced, hued flesh for generating corpses, and then Sever, and Sever applies vulnerable. I actually wanted to max out Unliving Energy as well for even more maximum essence, but sadly the build is already too thin on skill points, even though we get to gain some back from some interesting places. Blood Mist, and Blood Mist generates corpses. You notice only 1 point into Corpse Explosion. We don't care about Blighted Corpse Explosion because we don't care about Shadow Blight. It does nothing for our build. We don't really scale its damage in an effective way because we can't add on a multiplier of shadow damage over time, because that would do nothing for Sever itself. The base proc rate of it is very low on Sever, and the base damage of it, while buffed, is just kind of like okay. The other interesting part is that Lochran's crit chance very specifically doesn't apply to Shadow Blight. This is a bug which I've reported to the developers, but it's just interesting that that works that way. So we don't have 100% uptime on crit chance for Shadow Blight, so realistically its damage output on the build is like very subpar. We obviously are going to fill out Fueled by Death to be able to eat corpses for that multi, Death's Embrace for more survivability, more damage, Amplify for more damage, and then Decrepify with Abhorrent Decrepify. While Sever's lucky hit chance is absolutely trash city garbage bin, we have lucky hit chance at home. You do trigger this every once in a while and helps with Bone Storm uptime for builds that are still a little squishy. Maybe their gear isn't good enough, but I never really felt like we were in danger in this tier 100. Obviously at later tiers, that's going to be a different scenario, but I felt pretty fine. And again, we weren't even armor capped. I don't know how I survived. I'll be honest with you. This one's perplexing me. Corpse Tendrils with the ability to apply vulnerable, just the one pointed to Necrotic Carapace, you will over time gain your fortified status, which is basically just acting as a, when you would get hit for the first time, 15% DR, which is not a bad thing. Just 1 point into Reaper's Pursuit, 1 point into Crippling Darkness. I go back and forth on this. I think this would be better suited in Reaper's Pursuit to gain back a little bit of mobility here. Now obviously maxing out Gloom as well as Terror. The other cool part about having at least one lucky hit chance apply freeze is that you're able to very quickly apply terror bonuses without having to wait for your corpse tendrils uptime. So that's one of the reasons why I would generally recommend lucky hit freeze on the majority of darkness builds, just be able to trigger terror's like simultaneous double bonus as fast as possible. Down to the final part. Bone Storm, I currently need the point into Supreme Bone Storm to reach crit cap. My gear isn't good enough. My Lochran's is only at 36%. If Lochran's was perfect and I had very slightly better, like 1 GA on crit chance, I would have 100% crit chance, would not need this point. You can put this back up into mobility somewhere else. Inspiring Leader to hit crit cap, then standalone Memento Mori. And I am using Shadow Blight. Why? Because there's nothing else for us to use. So I might as well gain this little 44% damage proc every once in a while. It's not nothing. It's just not really relevant. That's kind of one of my major issues with the Sever build as it stands right now. It's only a shadow build in name, and it's only because these passives work for it. I'd rather build it as a bone build. It would be strictly better that way, because again, this just does nothing for it. I think that the darkness builds in general need a complete revamp, or perhaps 2 different key passives, one that works with dot, one that works with crit. You know, like the sorceress has 6 key passives, 2 for each type of element that you want to do with different outcomes. It would be cool if the Necromancer could get some love as well. I'm going to have the Paragon board set up in the planner. I did an interesting thing here, but I'll go over the idea of how we built into the Paragon board and the things that probably wouldn't be obvious to most people until you take another look at how we've set up the build. But in your starter board, we're going with Amplify, just a 1.1 mult. Then obviously, because we're a darkness build, our second board will be Bone Graft. We're going to be putting Essence here for the crit multi after a monster is no longer healthy. Tenacity is the largest amount of maximum life you can get from a single node. And then you'll notice that we built both into Reinvigorate and into Bone Graft. Just the weirdest combinations of things to do on a Shadow Darkness build, but hear me out. Building into Reinvigorate gets me 16, 20, 24, 28 maximum essence. 28 maximum essence that then feeds into Lochran's as additional damage multipliers. A very strong amount of damage to receive from this small input of additional Paragon points. This thing is basically a 1.1 multi just by itself. The second part that we're building into is Bone Graft, the legendary node. This says that as long as your Bone Storm is hitting targets, you're going to gain an 8% damage multiplier, so it's just a 1.08. Not as strong as a glyph, but we actually ran out of glyphs to be able to put into these boards for more damage. I was actually on an 8 board setup, before I realized the only other glyph I could put in would be darkness for DR, and instead I could build up to here. So one, we get the 8% additional damage just for having Bone Storm up, and then we gain 16 more maximum essence, feeding into Lockrins. That one's only representative of like a 4 or 5% damage increase, but this thing together is a 1.08 and a 1.05 put together. That's outperforming any 1.1 glyph you would normally put into your build for the same number of points that you would put in to be able to get those bonuses. This is like, I don't know, this one's interesting. Obviously, I then should have built out of this side for one of my boards, but this was a very end game addition to the board because I had 16 Paragon points left over and nowhere to build to. I would not be surprised if you see this tech making its way onto the vast majority of crit builds that the Necromancer has available to it right now, if Lockrinn stays the way that it does moving forward. This is the new, and if you see anybody else doing it, just let them know. They should credit me. I think I came up with this. The last of what we're building over into, obviously Exploit for the vulnerable damage multi, building over into Thick Hide for more maximum life, up into Flesh Eater, we're putting Grave Keeper because we're not actually going to be consuming corpses a whole bunch, so we're able to add up to having at least 6 on the ground fairly quickly. Flesh Eater for the multi, building up into the Witherboard finally for Abyssal, just for the 1.1 for non-physical damage. I do pick up the additive damage node here. It's probably not worth it in the end game, and this is where I could regain some of the points to build out to an 8 glyph board, but at least for right now, it was the best place where I could spend that point. Building up into Sent to Death, more maximum life here, the legendary node, and this is where we're putting Sacrificial for another 1.1, and then lastly, building up into the Hulking Monstrosity board, because this is the most efficient intelligence board that you can build at the end for the least amount of points, for another 1.2 multi whenever we crowd control, whenever we curse, whenever we Grasping Veins, if we stagger a boss. So obviously this isn't doing too much against bosses that we kill without staggering, but in the later game you will eventually be staggering your bosses as well, even though Sever is pretty bad at doing it, but inevitably this will activate there. But don't sleep on using Hulking as your final board with control. It's just the most efficient point for point that you can possibly get onto the vast majority of builds out there. So where does that leave us with Sever? Well, on paper, it's like performing better than both blood builds that I tried out, with I think significantly better gear. It is doing like fairly well. It's not quite Bone Spear. It's never really going to quite be Bone Spear because Bone Spear hits everything multiple times with like 6 projectiles, strictly faster at strictly higher damage numbers. But it feels significantly better than it currently feels in Season 4. I think that even in reality, I probably would want to bump up to a two-handed sword. Now, I know what you're saying, two-handed scythe, better damage. I think the attack speed here is limiting us in a fairly significant way. And I think that in certain circumstances, just gaining that a little additional attack speed, depending on what breakpoint we'll be able to get up to, might overperform it. So I wouldn't be surprised if we go to two-handed sword, most notably because the two-handed scythe is also losing like the only stat that kind of mattered, which was the life on kill, which did help with survivability, but now it has summoning damage. I get it, but also it's like kind of stinks that Sever Necromancer very specifically does not have a two-handed 0.9 attacks per second weapon, meaning it cannot benefit from a valuable additive stat on a weapon base that has the largest base damage. Just another kind of kick in the can for Sever because it's always just going to be like the redheaded stepchild of the Necromancer builds. But it's performing well. I think this did significantly better than I expected it to, and I'm nowhere near optimized. This is nowhere near perfect gear. I'm not even like above 4 masterwork rank on the majority of gear pieces. Even my Uber Unique isn't. My Crown of Lucian isn't. There's a significant amount of power to be able to put into this build and a much more efficient Paragon board that we can put onto it. But I'd like to hear from you. Do you think that Sever's going to be in a good place walking into Season 5? Did you have a chance to test it during the PTR? What were your experiences? What did you go with? I'd love to hear from you. As well, if you're brand new to the channel, go ahead and subscribe. You don't want to be missing anything, especially as we get closer and closer and closer to the reveal of the new class, the reveal of everything coming in the expansion, the Season 5 itself, being able to hold us over until that expansion launches. I'd love to have you here. Thank you very much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.